Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We're now in our second season, and we're more excited than ever to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. We look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here are issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show on oceans and waters. Today's show, Water Everywhere, Why We Must Care About Our Urban Waters. Water quality touches all of us each and every day, through the water we drink from the tap, through the water we shower in, we swim in, and that we use to water our plants and crops. And cities are certainly a big determinant of this. They have the one key characteristic, and that is that they're full of people, full of buildings and businesses. And because everyone shares that same relative space in cities, air and water, environmental impacts are concentrated in smaller areas, of course, including waterways, which is what we're going to talk about today. Urban waters take on large amounts of pollution from a variety of sources. As urban populations often share centralized water sources, this pollution creates public as well as environmental health hazards like lower drinking water quality and bodies of water that just aren't safe to swim in. Also, urban patterns of development often make waterways inaccessible to the adjacent neighborhoods, and lack of access limits a community's ability to reap the benefits of living so close to the water, whether through recreation, fishing, or just access to real estate. As you sip a glass of cool, clear water as you're listening to us today, you may think that water pollution is a problem somewhere else. But while most Americans have access to safe drinking water, potentially harmful contaminants from arsenic to copper to lead have been found in the tap water of every single state in the United States. And still, though, we're not hopeless against this threat to our clean water. And to better understand the problem and what we can do about it, let's go ahead and jump in with our first guest. And so here to help us explore this and unpack this some more today is B.J. Cummings. B.J. is a writer, she's a filmmaker, and author of the book, The River That Made Seattle, A Human and Natural History of the Duwamish, which was published in July of 2020. B.J. founded the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition in 2001, and she's been honored as a National River Network River Hero. She's been honored by Sustainable Seattle as a Sustainability Hero, King County Green Globe Awardee, and one of Seattle Magazine's 25 Most Influential People of the Year. B.J. is also with the University of Washington School of Public Health Superfund Research Project, and she manages their community engagement. B.J. holds a master's degree in environmental geography from UCLA, and she is the author and producer of numerous articles, books, and documentary films on environment and development issues locally and throughout the Americas. Welcome, B.J., and did I get all of that right?
Yeah, sounds like I should be a little older than I am, but yes, thanks so much, Bernice. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. B.J., one of the things I want to start out with to get people on the same page here is to look at watersheds and waterways. I often hear people refer to both of these. Can you explain to our listeners the differences in these two? And as well, how small can a body or trickle of water be to be called a waterway? For example, is a creek behind my house that seems to disappear off into a culvert, is that a waterway or watershed? Help us understand this better.
Sure. So starting with waterway, right? Any creek, trickle, brook, is a waterway. And usually we use the term waterway when we're talking about kind of fresh flowing waters. We might say water body if we're referring to a bay or an ocean, but it's anywhere where you find free flowing or sometimes not so free flowing water, it's going to be a waterway. It doesn't matter how small. A watershed is really all of the land that drains into those waterways. So sometimes even just a tiny little creek can have a huge watershed if it's, a dry, arid area and it's collecting water from a large landmass. The watershed could be really big even for a tiny little waterway. And just the same, you could have a big raging river that has a very small watershed if you're in a steep mountainous area where you're just getting the runoff coming straight down a steep hillside.
But a watershed could have potentially many bodies of water or many waterways within it, right?
Kind of. I mean, sometimes we talk about subwatersheds, so it's getting kind of into the weeds, but yeah, everything, all of the land that's draining into any given river or creek is its watershed.
Are there different types of waterways? And what's the importance of each of those and how do they intersect with the environment?
Generally, we talk about, names for waterways more or less corresponding to their size, right? So a river is going to be bigger than a creek, but that's really the only difference between them. And then the other way that we tend to distinguish waterways or waters is whether they're freshwater or saltwater. So it's kind of fluid, how big do you want to call a creek? How small, do you want to call something a river? But there's also places where freshwater and saltwater come together. So that's not a real clear line either. So like where I live in Seattle, we have an inland sea called Puget Sound. And water comes in from the ocean, but it also collects all of the water draining off of the many, many rivers that we have in this region. So that water is a mix of freshwater and saltwater, which is usually called an estuary.
But before we go any further on that, though, let's define so people really understand the freshwater and the saltwater and the in-between. What makes something each of those?
Freshwater coming out of rivers and creeks in kind of the central U.S., right, from the land. And then the ocean, of course, I think we all are familiar with what oceans are, those big bodies of salt water. If you have an area where those meet, you're going to get a mix of fresh and salt water, and that's an estuary. And that can be a bay, or it could be something that's more like an inland sea like we have here. But pretty much any place that is a shoreline fronting salt water is usually called a bay.
Do typical pollutants affect freshwater differently than they do saltwater? And if so, why? But that leads us into the other discussion that I really want to get to, and that is what are the various types of pollutants that affect our waterways? So that's two great big questions. You can start where you want, BJ.
So I think we're going to mostly focus on urban waterways today,
yes.
Which are usually the rivers or the creeks that flow through our cities, and sometimes our cities front on a bay, right? So or even on an ocean like Los Angeles. And the chemistry is a little bit different, but really the core issue is that the pollution that we put into our waterways is going to have some environmental impact, but it's also going to have an impact on the health of all of the critters that live in that water, and oftentimes also on the humans that interact with that water. So pollution into our waterways is not just an environmental concern, it's a direct human health concern, and it has impacted almost every community across the country and most people who live in our urban cities.
Yeah, I remember that. As I said in the intro, people don't think about it as we drink the water we're drinking right now, but they have found a lot of these pollutants in every state in the nation. So what are the primary things that pollute our waterways?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because we've had the Clean Water Act, which is an environmental protection law for our waterways in this country since 1972. But the number of chemicals that we have in our waters has actually increased since that time. So we have cleaned up some chemicals, right? Like we've gotten a lot of lead out of our water across the country, but at the same time, we've literally created hundreds of new chemicals that are now polluting our waters. So there's a lot of new pesticides. There's a lot of new chemicals that we use in cosmetics, things like that, that are now part of our water pollution problem. But the most pervasive pollutants that we see across the country tend to be a lot of our heavy metals like arsenic and mercury and lead and chromium and cadmium, and also a chemical called PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. You don't need to remember that, but they were banned from production in the U.S. in 1978, and we can still find them in almost every single urban waterway in the United States.
What are PCBs associated with? Where do they come from?
PCBs are an industrial chemical that was used mostly as kind of a lubricator. So you find it in everything from paint that you want to go on real smooth to electrical transformers. And the biggest problem with PCBs is that they cause cancer. And if you are in contact with the mud at the bottom of those rivers, or you're eating fish, especially out of those rivers, then they're going to impact your health.
That's a little concerning. We'll be right back on the other side with B.J. Cummings from the University of Washington. Thank you. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV service. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available online free for download at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body and non-mercury. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today on our show on oceans and waters. And we're back with B.J. Cummings from the University of Washington School of Public Health. Super fun research project. Again, thank you for being with us, BJ. Right before the break, you were telling us about some of all of the nasty chemicals that are in our waterways. And it was interesting to me that you noted that the Clean Water Act has been in place a while, but that now there are more chemicals than before. Is that simply because we have more new chemicals, or why is that? How did that happen?
Yeah, we're creating new chemicals, all the time, and typically at some point, in their life cycle, they're going to make it into our environment. So we're dealing with literally hundreds more chemicals than we had in circulation when the Clean Water Act was first passed. So while we've made progress cleaning up some of the chemicals that we knew about then, we're constantly now addressing new ones that are making their way into our waterways.
So it's like if we were to somehow magically be able to get rid of all chemicals that are in the water today at this moment, then we could probably count on next month, next year, there being more simply because of the new ones that are being put upon us to help us.
Yeah, as long as we're continuing to flush things down our drains, spill things on our roads, not have containment and creating new chemicals, they're going to get into our waters. So pollution prevention is really kind of the name of the game if we're gonna eventually have clean waters running through our cities or anywhere in our country. Pollution prevention, starting from kind of cradle all the way to grave, is going to be essential.
And that's one of the big things we hope to be able to get across to our listeners this month as we tackle the various aspects of oceans and waters, is that they may start in the waterways, interior, but most of that ends up in the oceans too. And our next guest, Tom Tsaky, is going to talk a little bit more about that and waterways as well. BJ, so we talked about chemicals, and I know that's coming from industrial discharges as well. Is there more chemicals getting into the waterways from the industrial sources or from our human usage, our personal usage sources?
It's really both. So,
Okay.
we use industrial chemicals, right? And industrial chemicals are a byproduct of things that are created for us. But then so we have what's called, point sources. You can kind of imagine a pipe from a factory spewing waste into a waterway. That's kind of really easy to imagine. But in addition, we have everything that's running off our cities in the case of urban waterways, right? So all those little stormwater grates that you see on every corner in a city, that's collecting all the pollution off of our yards, from our cars, from our streets. Everything that is spilled goes into that little grate, and a lot of that eventually makes it out into whatever the closest river or bay is.
That's a great point, and a great point for you to help our listeners connect the dots. So when it rains and we have these great big storms or even just a little rain, then water is flowing. We all see that. And we all see it going into the storm water collection point. So from that point, connect some dots for us in terms of some of the many things that you just told us about that are collecting, because that water is taking fertilizer and pesticides from our yards.
Oil from our cars, right? Just the cigarette butts that are getting flushed down through those drains, those have a whole range of chemicals in them, including some heavy metals. So
plastic bags, yeah. Yep. And so from the point we see it disappear into the stormwater drain, what happens?
So it goes into that stormwater drain, and in many, many cities, those stormwater drains connect directly to the nearest water body, whether that's a lake or whether that's a river or whether that's your bay. So the stormwater might just be flushing directly from your yard, from your cars, down through that drain and into the closest water body. In some cases, that water is collected and sent to a sewage treatment plant, but most of just the stormwater, urban stormwater, that does not happen today. It just flows directly into the nearest body of water.
Do municipalities have testing protocols for any of this water?
There are something called stormwater permits for cities, not universally yet, but increasingly those are spreading throughout the country. Mostly those rely on certain kinds of cleaning practices, so that's why you see street cleaners on the streets. But there's not a lot of testing of that just pure stormwater that goes on. A factory has to test what it's putting out, but for many, many, many cities around the country, we are not testing just the stormwater.
So this water, stormwater, flows into the waterways, our urban waterways, and it's got all these different pollutants and other yuckies in there. Talk to us about, from there, sitting in those waterways, how it begins to impact human health and environmental health.
Yeah. So one of the biggest problems for human health is when that runoff has actual human waste in it, right? So for example, I'll tell you again where I am in Seattle, we have the Duwamish River that flows through the city of Seattle. It's actually listed as a hazardous waste site, Superfund site, and we have direct discharges, right, pipes that carry both stormwater and industrial waste and human waste from our toilets, literally in cases where the sewer treatment system overflows, that goes directly into the river as well. So in Seattle, it rains sometimes, like most days out of the year.
Yes.
So we get that kind of overflow a lot, and there is a Department of Health warning not to swim in the Duwamish River if it has rained any time in the past 72 hours, right, for 3 days afterwards. You're not supposed to swim in the river because you could be swimming through human waste.
And that river flows meanders through most of the city?
It doesn't meander anymore. It used to, but it's been straightened and channelized, and it flows through the south half of the city, which, like in many cities, is our lower income part of the city. It's where most of our immigrant communities live. It's where most people of color live. It's kind of a classic case of environmental injustice here in Seattle, because the most polluted part of our city is exposing people who have the fewest resources and ability to get proper health care if it does impact their health. So that's kind of what happens with the water, but there's something else that happens, which is you have to remember that this pollution doesn't just carry human waste, which it does at times, but it also carries all those heavy metals we were talking about, right? It carries those PCBs that cause cancer. It carries a lot of oil products from our cars. And that stuff doesn't just flush out with the river flow. That stuff actually sinks to the bottom, and it contaminates the mud, the sediment at the bottom of the river, which is the base of the food chain, not just for the river, but for the entire Puget Sound in our case, for entire bays for other people. So at the base of the food chain, you now have sometimes feet deep contaminated toxic sediment, and that's coming up through the fish and the fishermen. And, in Puget Sound, we have these iconic orca whales all the way up to the top of the food chain, and it's making people sick.
And on last week's program, when we talked a lot more about oceans, one of our researchers did talk to us a little bit about food chain and explaining what that was. And I think in general, I grasped that the larger sea animals or seafood animals are at the top of the food chain, and the smaller ones are towards the bottom. And the smaller ones tend to be the ones we eat.
In some cases, we eat the smaller ones. In some cases, we eat the larger fish that eat them.
Okay.
But at the top of the food chain, that's us. And the pollution for many of these kinds of chemicals actually gets accumulated, right, bioaccumulated or stronger as it moves up the food chain, so that the people at the top of the food chain, or the animals, including us at the top of the food chain, are getting the biggest dose of those toxic chemicals.
As I was preparing, I did run across an article that talked about the effect of pollution in our waterways on the human endocrine system. And I'm sure you had to come across some of this in your study about the Duwamish Waterway, when you all investigated and talked about the health impact assessments of urban waterway decisions. Talk to us about that briefly, about your findings and recommendations as they apply globally to these waterways.
So there's all kinds of health impacts. I mean, we mentioned cancer, right? But if you're thinking about heavy metals, some of them, like arsenic, also cause cancer, but they have other impacts. Some chemicals, like lead, we know actually impact your neurological system and your brain. Mercury is another one that impacts, how your brain works. The Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland, had mercury poisoning. That's why he was, quote unquote, mad. So, and then endocrine, that's your whole hormonal system. So particularly for young girls and for people of reproductive age, any chemical that's impacting your endocrine system is a really big health concern.
It's a little scary. Can you tell us, though, about other findings that you all saw in your study and other recommendations that can perhaps help to guide and inform others in their urban waterway decisions?
Yeah, we took a look at the cleanup plan for the Duwamish River, which, because it's a contaminated site and it's listed under the Superfund law, has to be cleaned up, and asked a lot of questions about what the both intended benefits would be and how to improve on that, and also unintended kind of health consequences if we didn't do the cleanup the right way. So we were looking at things like impacts on fishermen, and if we don't do enough cleanup, what's going to happen to the fishermen that use this river? As the river gets cleaner, then there's going to be some things that don't affect their health quite so much, like some of those heavy metals. But also, if we don't go far enough, then what do we do to protect those folks' health? Do we just tell them they shouldn't be fishing here, in which case you wind up with malnourished families, right? Because they need to put dinner on the table. So the health effects can be both directly related to the chemicals that we're trying to prevent people from being exposed to, but also can be much larger issues having to do with, with food security and cultural survival and people's spiritual connection and family connections, to a fishing culture, and how that can, how losing those can also really dramatically impact an individual's and a community's health.
Thank you, BJ. And we're going to go to break now. And on the other side of the break, I just have two questions to wrap up with you, BJ, that I think are very important from the standpoint of our urban waterways. And then we're going to go to our next guest, Tom Tsaky. So we'll be right back on the other side of the break. Thank you. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on water everywhere, why we must care about our urban waterways. And we are here and we're wrapping up with B.J. Cummings with the University of Washington School of Public Health with their Superfund research project, where she did some work and wrote a book about their Superfund site, which is the whole urban waterway, the Duwamish River. And so she's really helping us understand this. And so right before the break, BJ, you were telling us about many of the dangers and the findings and the chemicals and what have you that you were finding in your river and that seem to be present in many of the other urban waterways. And so I just want to ask you a couple of more things, and that is arsenic seems to be pervasive. I've run into that in a number of our other shows on different other things, pollution, air quality, things like that. What would be the primary source for the arsenic that we're finding in your river and most rivers?
Yeah. So arsenic is an interesting one because it's a naturally occurring metal. But that does not mean that it's naturally occurring at the levels, in the amounts that we're finding. So in our case, we have a whole bunch of sources of arsenic, from factory smokestacks to mining that we're doing, deep in mountains where there's naturally high arsenic, but it's normally contained deep in the middle of a mountain. Right? And we bring that material down here to our river. We make things like gravel and cement out of it. But at the same time, we release a lot of it into the river where it poisons fish and then poisons people. So it is naturally occurring, but not the way that we're being exposed to it today.
Indeed. Last thing, BJ, and want to allow you to give some parting words, because what I've seen and we've all seen is that oftentimes issues and contaminants, chemicals, and health impacts with our water are not known until years past, like in Ferguson. So it's certainly important that people are aware. But what would your parting words be to ordinary people in their everyday lives as to how they can help drive solutions to the issues, environmental health problems with our urban waterways?
So I think first of all, really understand that there's a reason why we say water is life, right? This is not hyperbole, this is reality. You drink it, you bathe in it, you swim in it, and your food is grown in it. So keep that front of mind. Water is one of the most important natural resources that we have. And we talked a little bit about that cradle to grave, right? We want to make sure that we're keeping our own impact, our own use of any chemicals out of the water, right? Making sure that we're not letting pesticides run off of our yards and making sure that we're not letting oil run out of our cars. But bigger picture, we also need to be making sure that our environmental laws are being upheld and are being enforced. And that's something that we have the ability to do, by getting active in our communities and with our elected officials. And finally, we want to make sure that we're not just adding unnecessary chemicals into the products that we buy every day. So paying attention to what's in the products that you're using, on your hair, on your skin, in your house, and buying those that have a minimal environmental health impact.
Those things are in our control. Thank you so much. We've been with B.J. Cummings from the University of Washington School of Public Health, their Superfund research project. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you helping us.
Thank you, Bernice.
We want to turn now to a segment of our program we call Pulse of the Community, because it is about what we're talking about, oceans and waters, but it's a little closer from a different perspective. Recently, I read that a British poet once noted, "Thousands have lived without love, but not one has lived without water." Yet, while we all know that water is indeed crucial for life, as we talked about, we kind of trash it anyway. Some 80% of the world's wastewater is dumped, largely untreated, as BJ mentioned to some degree, back into the environment, thus polluting rivers, polluting lakes, and our oceans. This widespread problem of water pollution is jeopardizing our health, and unsafe water kills more people each year than war and all other forms of violence combined. Meanwhile, our drinkable water sources are finite. Less than 1% of the Earth's fresh water is actually accessible to us. And without action, the challenges will only increase by the year 2050, when global demand for fresh water is expected to be 1/3 greater than it is now. This is a lot, And so here now to help us understand this more, again, from the underground perspective, as it relates to both oceans and waterways, is Tom Tsaky. Tom is founder and CEO of TerraCycle, Inc. Tom is an innovator in recycling and upcycling. In 2002, Tom took a leave of absence from his studies at Princeton University to start TerraCycle. And while on the verge of bankruptcy, only 1 year in, he turned down a $1 million Carrot Capital Business Plan grant prize because investors wanted TerraCycle to become less focused on environmental responsibility, and Tom just wasn't going to have that. TerraCycle's initial breakthrough came in 2014 when it sold its fertilizer to Home Depot and Walmart. And since 2007, TerraCycle has teamed with corporations such as Kraft Foods, Nestle, Kimberly-Clark, Frito-Lay, Mars, Kashi, and L'Oreal, who sponsor the collection and post-consumer packaging by schools and nonprofits. For every piece of packaging that they collect, the company awards TerraCycle points, which can be redeemed for charitable gifts or for cash donation to the collector's charity of choice. TerraCycle then recycles or upcycles the collected waste into innovative products which are sold online and through retailers. Some 90,000 organizations have earned over $3.5 million in this process. And so from the humble beginnings in his Princeton dorm room, TerraCycle has grown into a global enterprise headquartered in Trenton, New Jersey, where, as part of its pledge to being a socially beneficial business to the local community, it also serves as a second chance employer, and it now has recycling and upcycling operations in more than 20 countries across the world, including Canada, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, the UK, Israel, and Turkey. Welcome, Tom. We're so glad you could be with us. And did I get all of that right?
Thanks for having me. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, social entrepreneur. It's really exciting what you all are doing, and you have a lot of insight to offer our listeners based upon this. Tom, let's start out by telling our listeners from your perspective and also help us understand why you did this business model with TerraCycle, and that's why recycling and upcycle are so important to our environment and our health.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from our point of view at TerraCycle, we're trying to really think about how do we solve for waste. And one of the first questions people ask is, well, what do I do with something when it becomes waste? There we really grapple with this question of why are certain things recyclable, like our aluminum cans, and we can responsibly recycle them, and why are other things not recyclable, like our chip bags or cigarette butts or even dirty diapers. And what we found is that it has to do entirely with economics, right? Aluminum can, companies can make money recycling, and something like, the rest of those examples, they would have to spend more money collecting and processing than the results are worth. So at TerraCycle, what we do is work with producers, retailers, and create national platforms so that people can now collect and recycle where otherwise they couldn't. And this is engaging about 250 million people, as you mentioned, across 22 countries now, collecting and recycling, everything from chewing gum to cigarette butts to dirty diapers and thousands of other waste streams. At least that's the beginning, to the process, and hopefully, as it pertains to questions of water, will at least have us prevent a lot of this waste ending up, in our waterways and in our oceans, though we also have to absolutely clean that up as well.
Do you have any sense of how much of some of these products, when they are not recycled, or should I say products or materials that are not recycled, how much of that ends up in our waterways? And if it doesn't end up in our waterways, where else is it ending up?
Sure. So it depends on also when, right? So it's important, because I'll give you the answer directly for today, but let's remember, up until the 1980s, even cities or up until the early 80s, even cities like New York City used to dump all of their garbage out into our ocean 10 miles offshore. And that was just till the early 80s. Today, the majority of what we would look at as marine plastic or ocean plastic typically starts in countries that are emerging or developing countries. I think Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, or Central America, Honduras, and other regions. And what happens is people, are now buying products in hard to recycle, bags and sachets and so on. And there is no formal waste management system. There are no garbage trucks or anything like that. So people may litter them, not because they want to litter, but because there's not really a good choice. And then when the rainy season comes, it washes into canals. Those canals go into rivers and rivers into the oceans. And you have this massive flood of garbage that goes into our aquatic systems. And the problem is that it's really hard to recover it. At TerraCycle, we run one of the world's largest ocean plastic collection efforts, but net, it only taking out a tiny percent of what goes in. A lot of it sinks, and only some of it floats, which can be collected again.
Thank you, Tom. And we're going to take up right there because you've just given some very important points, and we want to dig into them more. We're going to go to break really quick. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Food markets, Natural Grocers, Central Market, Sunflower Shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available online free for download at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body and non-mercury. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lynndentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to our show on oceans and urban waterways. And we are back with Tom Tsaky with TerraCycle, an international innovator in recycling and upcycling. And again, thank you, Tom. And Tom, you just so clearly explained to our listeners why they must care about this. And that is at the heart of Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. And so I appreciate you telling us about this. Before the break, we were digging into the percentage or how much of the trash or waste ends up in the ocean and the other places that it ends up. And you basically were telling us that so much of it ends up in the ocean because many other countries, I guess third world countries or other countries, don't have a trash collection system like we only had, and was it with the 80s?
That's right, yes. I mean, I think, we still, in the United States, contribute to this issue. When we litter, on our roadways, whether it's our cigarette or, a bag of chips, that very easily can end up, when the rain comes, in a sewage system or in a river system, and those will empty out in many cases into the ocean. And we have been historically massive contributors. Now that has shifted over in sort of great volume to emerging regions, like Southeast Asia, and places where the population is developing very quickly, starting to consume a lot of disposable goods, but not yet have the systems there where we can responsibly collect it. But we're all responsible for this, and I think the key question we have to think about, because in the end, we can ask, how does this affect us? Well, it ends up in our drinking water. When we're drinking water today, we are drinking degraded plastics that are in there already, whether it's a bottled water or our tap water, it's there. And we need to think about what we can do. Can we reduce our reliance on single-use products? Can we help, support these causes that allow for solutions to occur? Because it really is a global problem, no matter where it began.
It's one of those issues kind of like COVID, that it affects everybody, whether you think or realize it or not. That's why I like that quote I talked about earlier from the British poet. While you're sipping on that glass of water, you may think it's not polluted, but it may be, and everybody's got to have water. We can live without love, but certainly not the water. So, Tom, I know you all have partnerships with a number of companies and corporations trying to get some of this out, because you just talked about earlier where it's all going to end up. And it's a proven fact it's going to affect our health. We had a whole show on plastic pollution, and that stuff gets scary when you start digging into it in terms of things that it causes and the fact that we can't get away from it. Like you said, the nanoplastic. Mm-hmm. And I've been told even that when we open a bag of chips, that you've got the plastic particles that are, filter into the air, so we can't get away from it. But tell us a little bit about some of the companies and the partnerships that you all have entered into to help with the recycling. And what do you know, or what can you tell us about stats or anything else about the impact of those?
Yes, absolutely. So we try to do sort of three different things to combat this issue. The first is, how do we help create recycling for those things that we just can't recycle all over the world? So, there we work with corporations. You can check it out at TerraCycle.com. There's tons of free programs. We cover absolutely all the costs from shipping, even give small donations, for every piece of waste you collect. So far, just under $45 million has been donated, in this way. But we also directly run major cleanup efforts. We are working with nonprofit organizations all over the world, from the Gulf Coast all the way to New Zealand, collecting and recycling waste that has been washed up on beaches, in rivers, even directly from the oceans, and then those plastics get turned into things like Head and Shoulders shampoo bottles or other such things, so that they can be used again into an application. And then we also are trying, through a new ecosystem we have called Loop, trying to shift our dependence on single-use products, so that we can go back in the way things used to be with reusables, so that our products don't have to be disposed. Instead, they get cleaned and refilled and sold to someone else, so that you never have the issue of these things becoming waste.
And that seems to be the heart, really, of the matter, and totally the best way to stop it is at that point of origin. What are you seeing, and how have you seen the growth or the lack thereof since you've founded TerraCycle? What has been the trend that you're seeing towards single use or reuse of the products?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of inspiring solutions coming, which is really exciting. TerraCycle and Loop being just one small example of all that. But we are growing our dependence on single use much, much faster than the solutions are solving them. During COVID, for example, we are consuming 50% more single use products and packages than ever before. Now, I hope that's going to normalize, but still, even before COVID, our love of single-use products and packages, because they are convenient and affordable, have really grown. And that's the key thing we have to think about. The ultimate solution here is our relationship to consumption. I'd argue in many ways it is healthier for us and our planet to consume less. And then if we're going to consume, let's try to make the things we consume things that can then go around and be regenerative, things that can be reused, can be recycled, and try to avoid things that cannot, and then support, things that are trying to clean up, the ecosystem.
What are some of the products that TerraCycle produces in its upcycling processes?
We collect and recycle all sorts of hard-to-recycle waste streams, and in each of those cases, we look at how those waste streams can be, taken apart and made into new things.
What are some of those?
Yeah, sure. So, like cigarette butts, we shred them. We separate the ash tobacco paper, which is composted, and then take the filters and make those into new products like benches or railroad ties. And it could be, dirty diapers that get made into new industrial products, all the way to say chip bags that get made into watering cans. So there's quite a wide range here.
What if it was within the capacity of individuals to upcycle some of the stuff that they use?
Sure. I think if you can, upcycling, you can try to do that at home. You can take your juice pouches and sew them into backpacks and so on and so forth. It is absolutely a fun thing to do. And in the more large scale, these do require industrial processes.
Right.
But it's important to look at both. And it's also very important to look at reduce.
Maybe TerraCycle should consider that, producing or making some type of home kits that you can sell, and with those kits, I can make something useful out of my potato chip bags or plastic bags or whatever. That would be cool and fun, because as you started out in your presentation, a lot of it is just economics, for sure.
It's all about economics. What makes something not recyclable is that it just is not profitable to recycle.
Thank you so much, Tom, for joining us today. We really appreciate your contribution. And now we're going to go back to BJ so she can help us to dig a little bit deeper into some of this. I do want to ask you, taking up on what we were talking about with Tom, and that is low waste collection rates. And a lot of this has kind of led to unsafe water conditions. In your research on the Duwamish, how did that come up? How did waste collection interact into what your findings or any of your solutions or recommendations?
Sure. I mean, there are certainly lots of long-lasting pollution that results from the degradation, the breakdown, right, of a lot of the trash that gets into our waterways. So, I mentioned that there's heavy metals, and other chemicals in cigarette butts, right? And then Tom's been talking about plastic degradation, and that stuff sticks around and gets into our water, gets into our food sources, right? Gets into our bodies. So it's one of the things, though, that communities can actually take direct action on. So whereas they might not be able to control all the stormwater, coming through the city's sewer system or, what's coming out of the factory, they can control what they are personally contributing. And here in Seattle and in other places all around the country, right, there are community cleanups that are done all the time to collect all of the trash, that's accumulating around those storm drains, that's accumulating on city streets, that's accumulating in our parks and on our beaches. And that really makes a difference. And equally important, it's something you can do yourself.
Exactly.
So I love hearing what TerraCycle is doing with partnering with nonprofits that do those kinds of cleanups, because it really allows everybody to get personally engaged and understand their connection not only to the problem but to the solution.
Indeed. And last thing, we know you talked a lot about the fact that the Duwamish River is a Superfund site. Are there any other rivers or body of waters in the country that are Superfund sites?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we have thousands of Superfund sites around the country.
But that are actually bodies of water, yeah.
Yeah, many of them are our bodies of water. We've actually built industrial lands along our waterways all over the country, right? Easy to transport barges in and easy to just dump waste out. So we have Superfund sites on rivers and bays throughout the United States. And some of them are small, like one factory pipe is a Superfund site until you clean up that area. And some of them are really big, and the Duwamish is one of those really big ones. We have 5 miles of river flowing through the heart of the city of Seattle. That's a designated Superfund site that is unsafe for human contact and unsafe for people to eat the seafood that's in that river.
Indeed. Thank you so much, BJ, for coming back with us and helping us understand all of this. We have been with BJ Cummings from the University of Washington School of Public Health, Superfund Research Project, a noted author in terms of doing research on the urban waterways. And we've had Tom Tsaky, founder and CEO of TerraCycle, an innovative recycling and upcycling company. Thank you all so very much for helping us understand this and appreciate why we must care about our urban waterways. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourself. Each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up one way or the other to the change we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you, and join us again next week as we move on to talk about oceans and waters for the month of March. Thank you.